Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by the full crew. It seems like this is the crew now. Tracy, Cody, Bo, how are you all doing?
Doing great. I thought we were going to vote someone off the island, but yeah, I guess we could go with this crew.
I keep trying to leave the island.
We voted Karen onto the island. She's on vacation up at Whidbey Island in Washington. So I'm doing this without an assistant. Although we do have Matt here in studio. How are you doing today, Trace?
I'm doing great today. How are you, Pat?
I am just peachy fine. It's a Monday, and I'm glad to be at work.
I'm really excited about today's podcast topic because if anybody like me has shared Working Genius with friends or family or neighbors or colleagues, you have had something happen that we're going to talk about today. So, Cody, tell us about our title.
The Genius of Self-Awareness.
That's right. And we want to thank Cody for coming up with that genius title. The Genius of Self-Awareness. You know, when people say, are there any of the 15 types that are difficult or annoying? The real answer is no, none. They're all wonderful. It's fun to see people in their genius. Mm-hmm. There's a 16th type, and that's the person who is, for some reason, not aware of what their true geniuses are and not accepting of what their frustrations or competencies are. And when you're dealing with someone, and they're just not accepting what's true, it's really tough to celebrate them, and you have to do a lot of work to get to the underlying person. And so that's what we want to talk today about, is how important it is for people to be self-aware and how they can go about doing that. And that's the topic.
I think the reason I resonate with this so much is I'm excited to hear you coach both the person, Pat, who feels perhaps resistant to their report or to the type that they said that they are, and to help those of us who are face-to-face with, again, family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, who then are resistant to that idea. So, I don't know which one sounds more fun for you to start with, but
I just thought of an analogy.
Great.
If you knew somebody that had really bad breath, that would be their working frustration, right? But they knew it. And they were like, hey, just so you know, my breath is horrible. Tell me when to put gum in. And you would be like, oh, that's almost endearing that they know that. I'm really sorry for you. I can feel bad for you. But if you felt like you couldn't tell them and they always denied it, man, that would be so frustrating and even angering because you feel like you have to pretend they don't. And that's why whenever you're with a person and they go, oh yeah, my working frustrations are these, I hate those things. And if you ask me to do it, I'll do my very best, but I'll probably do it terribly. And I'll be the first to tell you that. And even my working competencies, I know I'm not as good as you are that have it as a genius. So don't think that I'm taking pride in that. And if I make a mistake, I will be so happy for you to point that out to me. Everyone has grace for people who know themselves. It's when you know somebody and they're not good at something and that you're supposed to pretend like they are, that's where you can get really frustrated.
I noticed this the last time that I heard you give your Working Genius speech, Pat, is before you unpacked each of the 6 types. You said, okay, now pause. There's going to be 2 of these that are your genius, 2 that are your competency, and 2 that are your frustration. Almost anticipating some of that objection of, well, how many of these do I have? Helping to normalize the fact that all of us, the author of the book has 2 frustrations and 2 competencies. Everybody has 2 of each. I think helps put people a little bit at ease of, okay, I'm going to expect that some of these are very draining and exhausting to me.
Yeah. And then you can actually give them grace, And if they make a mistake, you don't feel like you're dancing around it to tell them. You're like, oh yeah, you really do suck at that. See, here's what happened. That's okay. Let's make it better though. As opposed to like, hey, I don't want you to feel bad. It's like, of course you won't feel bad. We all know you're not good at that. So let's do better.
And Pat, you sort of alluded to this before we hit record, but as you're saying this, there really have been 2 types of conversations that play out this way. Because part of accepting your working genius and your working frustration is about vulnerability and humility. There's a version of the conversation where if it's not going swimmingly in that way, it might be because we're identifying a lack of vulnerability or a lack of humility. The other, what you mentioned, might be a lack of emotional intelligence or awareness around that. And so those two playing out in different ways. I know I've had many of each of those conversations, and we go about them differently based on the nature of the source.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, I want to say this, Cody. That's a great point. You reminded me that this is a very much of a small or a rare problem. Most people we find take the assessment and they go, "Oh my gosh, this explains it. I'm so relieved not to have to pretend anymore. I'm so glad to know that, yes, I'm not good at that. Yeah, I'm okay at that, but it burns me out. And I love this kind of stuff." And for most people, I was even doing this with some teenagers yesterday, and they were like so glad to have their type confirmed. And one of our guys in our office just got certified last week, Joel, and he said his favorite thing was he had some friends over and he knew them and he could predict it, and then they took the assessment and it matched. So for most people, they get their results back and they're like, "This is awesome." It just, there's those people who, for whatever reason, either because it maybe hurts their pride a little bit or because they've just never been told or never really accepted, that they're kind of in denial about especially their limitations. And we've all talked about people we've met and wonderful people we love who will say, "Oh, no, I think I'm really good at that." And everybody around them is like, "Oh, no, you're not." And it's a really painful thing to have to convince them. It's a beautiful thing when they finally admit, okay, now I realize I'm terrible at that. And you can go, wonderful. But anyway, that's what we're talking about. Those rare people who, for whatever reason, either pride or lack of self-awareness, have a hard time coming to terms with what they're not great at.
And I'll say this, Pat, it is so worth pushing through the pain of that conversation, because on the other side, I've seen so many people who are wearing the wrong letters in some way. Like they're either out of the, lack of humility or maybe the assessment was slightly skewed for them. And they are trying on these letters, like whether they think they're a DW or a WD for a little while or something like that. On the other side of the uncomfortable conversation is where you get to experience the freedom of going like, boy, this is how I'm wired, and I don't have to feel guilt or shame that way. But in that little middle ground, especially if they're resistant to it, it feels painful, and it's worth getting all the way through, because on the other side, there's so much relief, but it requires you to go through a pretty difficult conversation.
Yeah, this whole model came about because I don't have galvanizing as a genius. Now, it'd be very easy for me, based on my past and what my role is here and what I do, to think that I'm supposed to be awesome at that. And the relief that came from me saying, "Oh, I don't like doing that. When I do it, I get kind of grumpy. And I know that that's not a strength of mine." That was huge. But if I had to go around pretending, no, I'm a galvanizer. Oh, yeah, I can do it because I'm the leader. Man, it's painful for other people around them to go, "Okay, boss, we'll pretend that you're good at that." But that's a real loser of credibility right there.
I wonder if we actually could use Working Genius to help us in conversations with people. Because I'll tell you where I feel like this has gone wrong for me is when I jump right to galvanizing somebody to convince them of what I think their geniuses are, instead of starting back with wonder to ask questions, which I'm curious what questions y'all might ask. Tell people, think about, why would I be resistant to this? Or where have I seen my geniuses come out? Or what is it that gives me life and joy and fulfillment? What do you think about that?
I was thinking a very similar thing, which is, one, you can use Working Genius, but also be aware that because of your own Working Genius, the way you might have that conversation would be different. Like if I'm talking to someone who's resisting the fact that they think tenacity is not a frustration for them, as a discerner galvanizer, I'm just like, "Hey, well, you remember that thing and that thing and that thing. If you had tenacity, you probably would have finished all those things by now." Whereas someone with the genius of wonder, who is less, disruptive and less galvanizing, might say it this way. They might say, "Well, do you think that if you had tenacity, that this project and this project and this project maybe would be done?" And I do think that there is a natural way for us to engage in those conversations based on our own Working Genius. But I like the idea of being aware too about how would you even approach that using Working Genius as like a communication tool to get people to where they are. And I'll say one other thing, Pat, because we run into this a lot. I do feel like very often when I'm dealing with the conversation that is in the pride category of the like, I kind of don't want to tell people that I'm bad at a certain thing. It really does go back to working genius being a measure of your joy and fulfillment over your competency at that thing. Because it's okay to say, hey, you know what, you're even relatively good at that potentially on your teams, or you've developed that skill, but you can't sit there and say that you enjoy that. And if that was your job all day, that you would feel fulfilled, and that tends to change the conversation.
And this is why I think it's so important for people to understand that the difference between something being your genius and even a competency is huge. And it's worth noting. It doesn't mean you can't make up for that or work at it or be terrible. And I'm going to use Bo as an example. Bo's an IG, okay? So an inventor galvanizer. I love him being an IG. I love it. I love it. I love it. I think he's very bright. I don't think he's terrible at discernment, but he will let people that have a genius of discernment speak into him in a way that if his pride were like, I don't need your discernment, I'm smart enough as it is, it would be so much harder. So inventing with Bo is so fun because he opens up the door for discerners and doesn't make you feel like you have to hit him over the head with a stick to let you in. And it makes it such a joy to work with Bo. And what's funny is as a result of that, as a result of not being defensive, his discernment actually keeps improving because he's not trying to pretend.
It's very kind of you. I think that is in large part due to the environment, which is Pat, you've talked about this very publicly. We have a team full of discerners. And so it would be the most natural thing in the world for the guy who is the one without discernment to feel some shame about that or want to cover that up. But my geniuses are so welcomed by our leaders, and there really isn't shame about your competencies or frustrations. And I've seen people fight, especially for discernment, fight to be able to say, I have discernment, discernment, when they feel like it is the best genius or the one that's going to be most praised or the one that's most accepted. And so if you've got somebody on your team or in your family, if you really, really believe all 15 pairings are delightful, all 6 geniuses are needed, I think that it creates an environment where people are soften up a little bit, open up a little bit to be able to discover more who they are.
Yeah, so that's a good way to do it. It's a good way to help somebody who's maybe a little bit in denial about their limitations is to really celebrate their true geniuses. In other words, make them confident. It's like the Michael Jordan thing. Stop working on your jump shot. Just keep being great at what you're great at. And then the jump shot will come along because you don't feel like you have to be.
Let's talk a little bit about when people get their geniuses wrong. We've talked about limitations. What happens? Because I know that's very confusing for me. When someone tells me, hey, this is my type, and it clearly isn't. How does that play out?
That's a great question. How does it play out? I haven't thought of that.
I actually have had a handful of conversations where people were at minimum confused or felt like it was a gray area, and at maximum maybe like really convinced that their geniuses were something other than what they were in their day-to-day life and the way that's played out in their life. And I recently, just this week, actually had a conversation with someone who I've known for a long time who actually made it all the way through working genius certification. They actually went through the certification, and we still had to wrestle with what their genius was, so they were really confident about one of them. And I will say this, more often than not, there's one that seems like it's definitely true, and you're deciding between the second one and what might be their first competency. I would say that's it's very rare for someone to not know either of their geniuses out of the gate. And we ended up having a conversation where we talk about breaking ties, and we do all the normal things that we would do around breaking ties. Like, would you rather be in a room and you're describing the context of like in this case, what a discerner would enjoy versus what an inventor would enjoy. And just trying to play that out. And it's, again, about more enjoyment. But I will say this, I think it's really important to say, like, even the people who swim in this every single day, we had Matthew Lencioni actually mistyped for over a couple months. And I think it starts to bear itself out as you think of it more as trying on. If you're unsure, think of it as like, I'm going to try on these 2 letters. And it starts to prove itself out in the context of your team to say, oh, actually, you're not showing up as much of a disruptor as a galvanizer would. Maybe that's not really it. And it starts to become more and more clear, but it really is in the context of teams. I feel like people figure it out.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You know, one of the things, Cody, I think, is I was just writing this down. I think that people don't, they often claim the D. They want to have the D, but people often deny they have W because it's so subtle. I think a few people we've realized, I think you're a W, and they didn't see it because it's such an internal process. Now, the one that people never claim if they don't have it is T.
Yeah.
People are pretty like, yeah, I suck at that one. And the one that people don't deny if they have it, I think is E. I think people know when they're in E. Although sometimes people might, I suppose, not want to be. Sometimes people deny that that's even a genius, and it totally is. But generally, you can pretty much talk people into like, but I think you do that. And they're like, yeah, you're right. I'm an E. What are you going to say, Trace?
I'm not sure about that one. That one is tough. It's so interesting. I think, and this might be controversial to say, if so, we can cut this out. But sometimes
I know what you're going to say. I was going to say it too, but I think you're right.
I think sometimes women in the workplace have a hard time with it.
Yes. Yes. Because they think, oh, you're just saying that because I do what you ask me to do.
Yeah, and it's a sign of weakness when in fact it's not.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I'm glad you said it. I love, Cody, the idea, and I just want to highlight it again, of kind of letting people try on their genius, to not just have this be a one-time conversation. I found that really helpful if somebody's wrestling to say, let's do like a joy audit over the next week and try these on and see how they fit. This is new insight for you. It might be something that you kind of need to experiment and learn from yourself about. The other thing that I think is really helpful in those conversations is to use the pairings names. Because if somebody is wrestling between two different geniuses, to be able to say, okay, you think maybe you're a DG or you think maybe you're a DE, would you be more likely to describe yourself as somebody who intuitively activates? Or would somebody in your life be more likely to describe you as somebody who's like an insightful collaborator? And at least 50% of the time, a light bulb goes off where somebody goes, oh, they would call me an insightful collaborator.
Yeah, I think this is really important. Keep in mind that what we're talking about is what you need to do for maybe 5 or less % of the people who take this. Other people are like, yep, I know exactly who I am. But for those who don't know, this is a really helpful thing. The pairings help narrow it down. The other one is ask somebody who knows you really, really well. And that can be really helpful. Not that they're going to tell you the answer like Cody or I would, but that they're going to like help you explore this and help you understand what you are. Because going through life thinking that you're something that you're not is so painful, not just for you, but for the people around you. And it makes it hard for them to tap into your geniuses.
Yeah. Well, I just would second that, using the pairings labels or the names around the pairings, because that has in many occasions like flipped the scales on someone either identifying as their second letter of their genius or realizing that they're not. I will say, as an observer, one of the things that I use is responsive and disruptive. I mean, it's so clear that Bo, who has invention and galvanizing, is a double disruptor as a human being in our work environment, or in your own family. Is like, I'm going to come up with an idea, I'm going to rally people around that, and then it's simultaneously just as clear. One of the ways we'd mistype Matt is we thought that he had a disruptive genius, and after working with him for a couple months, it was really clear he was double responsive. He was always waiting to be pulled into the conversation and asked his thoughts around certain things. So there, as an observer, you can kind of tease that out as well. So it's kind of interesting because it's like a Rubik's Cube of helping people solve that puzzle, where you can kind of do it with the pairings. You could do it with asking a close friend. You can talk about whether it's a pride or a emotional intelligence issue, or you can, do responsive disruptive. I think all of those are super helpful.
You know what else we're going to do? We're coming up with something right now. We're coming up with mottos or sayings that describe each of the pairings. Like, this would be their saying. And so that's going to be yet another thing where people are going to go, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I look at things. And that's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. So look for that on the Working Genius podcast. Hey, Bo, do we have some news we want to share with people?
Yeah, we are so excited. Working Genius launched 2.5 years ago. We have been continuing to develop the full suite of Working Genius products. And so many of you that listen to the podcast have taken the assessment. You've heard us talk about certification. We also have 2 other products that help you in your team be able to fully implement Working Genius. And one of those is the Working Genius Workshop, which you can find out about online. We have workshop facilitators that will virtually or in person come and help your team be able to fully implement Working Genius. And another is the team application guide. That's great for the kind of do-it-yourself leader who's looking for tools to be able to help have a great conversation about Working Genius, and then some video resources for you and PDF resources for you as a leader. And what this is all in service of is to help the world, help you as leaders and people be able to take these principles that are helping to bring more joy and fulfillment to people's lives and be able to use them.
All right. Thank you, Bo. All right. Yeah. And those Working Genius, the certification programs, they just keep selling out. And so we do have 40 open spots in May.
That's right.
Which will go away they'll go away in like a week and a half. So if you want to grab it and get certified, check it out. All right. I think that's it for today. Self-awareness. It's a wonderful thing. I think I might have called it the genius of self-awareness and humility, because it's humility to accept what you're great at and what your limitations are. Hey, you guys, thanks for joining us on the podcast. We'll talk to you next time. God bless.